Canada, it's completely different. And so when I came to Canada and realized that in fact our whole world surrounds around the news media, it was a big cultural shock, but it's also very interesting. So what we do know is that when we talk about the news media today, it's also more complicated than you would think. Because when you look at these pictures, you see the national newscast, but you also see the local newscast, and then you have the Chinese language, and they compete with each other. And you also have the Punjabi language newscast that is broadcast in their own language. So we really have a lot. But then when we talk about broadcast media, it's not just TV that we're talking about. We're talking about radio also. Radio is an even more vibrant scene. And when you look at the number of pictures, and there are a lot that I have actually left out, but I did put in RJ, radio.
I saw that.
Yeah, and I learned that from my colleague at the David Suzuki Foundation, that Red FM, RJ, they're really kind of the mainstream Punjabi or ethnic radio. And then we also know that there's the Chinese language radio, there's the Cantonese speaking language radio medium, and also the Mandarin nowadays. And then there's also the CBC radio, which has the whole slew of programs and channels. And then there's also the All News channel and CKNW. So there is a lot, but then broadcast medium is only, they're only one part of the media that we're talking about. Then we also have print media, and which is basically today, when you look at it, it's exactly the same. It's not even more complicated. It's even more competitive, actually, that you have the local Vancouver Sun, but then you also have Globe and Mail, but also has Globe and Mail, which is supposed to be a national paper, but also has a BC page nowadays, and that competes with the local paper. And you also have the community papers that I remember, whether I worked at the CBC newsroom or at the Fairchild newsroom, whether I was a young reporter or whether I was the senior editor, the first thing that we know is that we always come back with this pile of community papers from Burnaby, West Ender, Richmond, that read those, and that's the job of the researcher and reporters. If you want to have a promotion, you better have read all these papers, because you need to know what the local communities are doing. So that's a big deal. And when I worked for CBC as a news reporter, one of the big things that I was told was that we were actually in the middle of a campaign to promote local news. So that whole newscast at 6 o'clock was the local newscast. That, that was key. And so that is a big deal. And when we look at the Chinese papers, and also there are also the Asian Pacific Post, and I think what I like about a lot of the South Asian papers is that they're actually written in English, so everybody can understand, as opposed to when I look at my own Chinese language paper, it's really in the language that you need to know those languages. So Ming Pao, Sing Tao are the mainstream, but then there's also the World Journal and the Global Chinese Press, which complicates things because it also indicates that right now the Chinese community is actually more than just Cantonese, but is actually the Mandarin-speaking people. So as a result, you have papers that come out and sell really well because they cater to a specific newer market, which is the immigrant from mainland China. So those are the media that we have seen. And of course, I also wanted to add social media, because this comes back to the main question that we asked, that do we actually communicate with each other with all that, the plethora of different, the broadcast, the radio, the TV, the paper, and then there's also the social media. And I would say that the mainstream media, be it whatever language, really needs to learn from the social media. Because communication among social media, I think that is the whole key and the reason social media is around, because social media communicates with each other. Sharing is the key of social media, but that is not necessarily the case with mainstream media. So let's look at whether mainstream media actually communicate. Do we work together? So I put together this, and yesterday I came to sit in front of my desk, and I wanted to think, if we're not communicating as much, the question of whether it's practical or not, and what are the reasons. So with the question, is it practical? I think that it is yes, and also it is no. And the three reasons that I put there is mainly why it's no sometimes. First of all, resource is definitely a problem. Technology is another problem, and language is definitely a big barrier right now. But at the same time, is it practical? It is, because communicating is just a phone call away or an email away. So on the big scheme of things, I would say that why is it not practical? Of course it's practical, it's easy. But at the same time, we don't do it as much, and we don't do it enough, and because we have all kinds of barriers. And I will share with you later about personal stories that I've gone through, why these factors came to my mind yesterday when I put the slides together. And those are real issues that I have gone through personally. And so the other thing that we also wanted to ask is, communicating and working together among mainstream media, is it realistic? And I would say that it's actually not very realistic. And two big reasons is the dollar sign. Money is the big problem. And also, ego, as I found out, was actually a big deal. So, and I would share with you a little anecdote when I was really very fresh out from my first bachelor degree in history from Simon Fraser. And I started working for this Chinese language TV station. It wasn't called Fairchild then, it was called Cafe TV. It's a local TV station, and our office was in the basement. It got flooded all the time. So I don't even know how we survived, but we loved that place dearly because everybody worked together and there was no office politics. So, but at the same time, when I was working for Cafe TV at that time, as a young reporter, I wanted to do everything. And I think that I thought I was invincible. So you go out and do stories, and then you're interviewing the same people, the same important people with the same important reporters from Global TV, from CBC, and oftentimes they're very nice to you. So there was one time that I was tasked assigned by the news director that let's do a long piece, a 5-minute piece, which is a long piece for TV, to look at the mainstream media, what are they doing, and what are they about? And so I did that, and I interviewed this reporter called Colleen Leung, and she was a rising star at Global TV. And so the interview request was also given to the news director at that time. And Colleen actually answered my call and did the interview with me. I went to Global TV, and it was still in Burnaby, and I was so thrilled. And our cameraman was just like, we were all jumpy and so nervous. But Colleen told me one thing, and one of the questions that I asked is exactly what we're asking today. That why is it that we don't work with you guys as often? And Colleen said to me that has it ever factored in your head that there's such a thing called ego? That especially, because I was asking that we broke so many news, sometimes with the Chinese community. So why is it that these stories never get into the Global TV? People should know these things are happening. Like the Hong Kong new immigrants in the early 1990s were buying up South Granville, and they were called the Gucci Po people. And the Chinese media were covering, and we were covering, and not being defensive, but also to find out why are they buying new cars and why are they buying big new homes? Because they were immigrants coming here well prepared, with lots of money, and of course they buy new homes. Because who would want to live in a smelly old house? Especially the fact that you don't have to. So those were some of the cultural differences that was happening, and my question for Colleen then was that why did Global TV not also reflect that reality at the time? And Colleen said to me that, well, do you think that a big TV station like Global TV will come knocking at Cafe TV's door and ask you guys, hey, so how should we be reporting on these new immigrant stories? So that was the first experience I had, that ego actually plays a big part in the mainstream media. And today it's even more complicated because these tiny little Cafe TV has become national cable broadcasters, and they also have ego now. So communication becomes even more difficult. So to wrap up, I think that I wanted to add one more question to the presentation. That is it workable, is it doable, is it realistic, but is it necessary? And I think it is. Because if we don't communicate and don't start working together as the media, which is supposed to be the only good guy in our society, then we suffer. Because we're supposed to be journalists, and we go by the rules of accuracy, fairness, objectivity. But if we don't start communicating with each other in a world as complicated as today, then we are constantly faced with error and bias. And those problems will outweigh the goodness of the work that we do, and that is just wrong. So to wrap up, I found this on the internet, and I think because we're talking about news media, it's journalism, and we really do have ethical issues, factors, guidelines, however you want to call it. But then there are reasons why we do journalism. It's not to make ourselves into millionaires, of course, but then to really do something for our society and to make sure that everybody is smarter at the end of the day. So you don't need to always agree, but at least you need to know before you disagree. So that, all these factors together, I think we really should start thinking that, if communicating with each other, working together, is it prime time that we throw away these ego problems? Money might be difficult to fix these days, but of course it's doable. And I mean, my last note is of course. Thank you.
All right, the second exciting portion of this afternoon is question and answers, right? So who's going to ask the questions? They will ask the question. Are you all awake? So, your questions.
Media is now controlled by very few media players.
Right.
So, do you think there's a really diversification of news sources in media right now?
Aldous?
I mean, to some extent, so if you couldn't hear the question was in an environment where most media is owned by a few multinational organizations. Is there actually diversification in news media today? Again, the answer, I hate to use that yes and no, but in some ways, yes. There's always going to be the human desire to get a different angle in the story. But it's not just the fact that the news is owned by a fewer number of major organizations of broadcasters. It also has to do with resources. News organizations are being asked to do more with less money. And so for their websites, when websites started in Canada, news websites started, all the broadcasters were sending out their own web reporters. And then they started realizing it's too expensive to have our own online reporters. So they started getting the radio and the TV people filing stories online. Then they said, it's still too expensive. So we're just going to buy the service from Reuters, from this news wire, that news wire. So if you go to CBC News now and actually read it, you're like, is this Canadian perspective anymore? We're actually, that's one of the biggest issues. Like Canada, CBC will always belong to the Canadian public. But if you look at who's producing the news online, and it's not because they don't want to, it's just a reality that we're not paying more money for the CBC. We're not giving the CBC or any other broadcaster any more money to do all the things that they have to do now with the same amount of money, so that they're having to make some serious decisions around that. So that's a very real thing. Now what's balanced that is actually social media, right? Like we could not get enough information about the tsunami in Japan, because it was the same news sources sending everyone in the world the same information. But where we were getting real, unique insider perspectives was in fact Facebook, Twitter, and blogging. And so there's a little bit of yes and no to that answer.
I wanted to add also that I totally agree with Alden that these issues are so complicated that it's always a yes and no, and it really depends on the percentage of
Yeah.
how big the yes is and how big the, or how small the no is. But I do think that the media concentration of ownership is a problem, because now that, especially when I work in climate change for the David Suzuki Foundation, then we look at the articles that comes out when it comes to climate change and how many media actually are interested in talking about this and how much effort do we need to engage them to talk about these. And it's really disturbing. So when you look at, for example, used to be called Ken West and now is Post Media. So I really hope that we have more people like Mike D'Souza of Post Media. But then the thing is, you only have one Mike D'Souza, and he actually writes the truth about what is really going on. Sometimes it's not that the media is not telling the truth, but then the even scarier thing is that when they ignore the issues that we should know about for various reasons, and then the other factor is that when they start self-censorship themselves. We see that a lot of that in Hong Kong. When Hong Kong was transferred to mainland China, which is a communist system, and the communism is not a big deal now because it's really capitalism